Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I must tell you very quickly an anecdote when I drove up here this morning to my hometown. And I've not been here for 40 years. And I was waiting to pick Sarah up from the station. She'd come up from Cambridge. And I was talking to one of the station staff, and he said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to Salford Quays." And he looked at me very wistfully, and he said, "The Venice of the Irwell Valley." And I thought, well, I'd just tell you that one to lighten the mood. We're going to talk about potential, and we're going to talk about impact. We're going to talk about how we're going to raise potential, and how, first of all, we're going to preserve the impact we have, because we have Holocaust survivors, and how we're going to grow and develop that impact. For those who don't know of us, we are the only dedicated Holocaust memorial and education centre in the UK. We are based in the middle of the country. We are there because the founding family lived there. We started from very humble beginnings 20 years ago, and we are still there, much bigger than we were when we started. It's a multifunctional museum. It's about memorial, it's about being a museum, and it's about being an education centre. And we are home to one of the only exhibitions in Europe that is tailored to engage with primary age children. And I'll say more about that later, because already you should be asking, how on earth can you reconcile those two things? Primary age children, Holocaust education. In terms of schools themselves, we have over 20,000 a year school children visitors, that's apart from adults. And it's principally those that I'm going to talk about today and how we're going to raise that game. So there we are in the middle of the East Midlands, in the middle of rural Nottinghamshire, or as our friends from London like to remind us, in the middle of nowhere. Very London-centric, much of what we do. Our purpose there, just to remind you of the three things. I'll come back to those three things. We're first of all a memorial to all those who are lost. We are a museum, so we provide two exhibitions, age-appropriate, one for younger people, one for older people. And we are also a learning centre that really looks not just at the Holocaust, but what it means today in terms of personal responsibility, promotion of fairness and justice, and it is a challenge. It's about challenging people today to take positive action. In terms of the gardens, they're wonderful. If ever you visit us, they're a wonderful, peaceful place, and important because there are over 1,000 white roses that are planted in remembrance of victims of the Holocaust. Every one of them has a memorial attached to it. Every one is a personal testament to those that were lost. It's quite a compelling place. It's a very sobering place when you come in. But a bit like Holocaust education itself, if it's done badly, it will traumatize people. And you can't learn if you're traumatized. Done well, it's like education itself done well. It should bring hope. And this is part of what we try and do. It's about what lives on as well as what was lost. In terms of the museum and the exhibitions, I mentioned that we have two. The first one is now 20 years old. It's getting a bit faded, a bit like me. It's losing bits and pieces. And it is very traditional in the sense that it's linear. There's a fair amount of text, photograph, and film, and audio. And it follows the chronological events of what led up to the Holocaust and some of the aftermath. There is a lot of space, although it's in a very tight, dark area, as would be befitting from the subject matter. There are a lot of survivor testimony through short films, through audio, and their artifacts. And again, it's a bit like the gardens. It's about reducing what happened to a personal level. Many of you will hear figures bandied about, and children often come with things like 11 million, 6 million bouncing around in their head. How on earth do you reduce that to a human level? How do you make people today, young people today, understand that this is all about the human condition? So a lot of what we try and do is to bring it down to that very personal level. There is a large pile of stones when you come into the gardens. We think they're about 350,000 stones in that pile. We aim to build it 1.5 million, the number of children that were murdered in the Holocaust. We ask every visitor to place one stone on the pile and think of one person, not the statistics. And a lot of what we do is about that personal impact. It's about creating a dialogue so that children, adults know that this is about you, it's about me, it's about all of us. The second exhibition is the one that I told you about, designed for primary age children. It's called The Journey, and it follows the fictional story of a 10-year-old German boy. It is fictional, but alongside everything that Leo says as you go around the exhibition, there is testimony. There is archive material that we have filmed. So, for example, you go into Leo's living room, then you move through into his schoolroom, and then into the street, a street scene during Kristallnacht, into his father's tailor's shop, and eventually into his journey to England. And it's really important that people realize that it's fictional only in the sense that it's an amalgam of those survivor testimonies. So, for example, in the schoolroom, he talks about being sent to the back of the class, and so he doesn't sit with the other children because he's a Jewish boy and he has to stand at the back of the class. In real life, if you click onto the kiosk, you'll get a film up of one of our survivors, Ruth David, who says, when I was in school, I was told not only to stand at the back of the class, but the teacher came and drew a chalk circle around me, and I stood there inside that chalk circle all day, every day, whilst I was in that school. So it is not embellishing a story, it's trying to tell it simply, but using real testimony. It's kinesthetic, it's tactile. You go in there, you can touch anything, whether it's the toys, whether it's the old telephones, whether it's the furniture, whether it's the crockery, whether it's the clothes that are in the wardrobe. It really is immersive, and children start through the testimony, the diary that you listen to in every room of Leo. You start to develop empathy for this child and for what's happening to him. So what are we trying to do with it? We're trying to make sure that by the end of that experience, children will understand about choices, what choices people have today, what choices people had perhaps in the past. And what are the consequences of individual decisions? And what does that mean today for personal responsibility? It is one that adults find just as moving as the children. We have many adults come out upset because the dilemma of do you give up your child to come to England on the kinder transport, because that's what the story is about. And that's why you can reconcile the two. It is a universal story. It is the story of refugees. It's the story of escape in 1938 after the November pogrom in Germany and coming to England as a place of refuge. But it's all about loss. It's all about identity and what happens to identity. And it's all about what can be built up from that point. Those are the expectations we have at the end of the session. More and more, our collections are building, or our collection is building. It's really interesting that as survivors, and the average age of our survivors who speak there every day is 87. We are still finding survivors who've never given their story. They want to come and tell us their story, and they want to give us artifacts now, at this age. And that possibly is about their approaching end. They are very self-conscious of that. They often, if they've never told their story, and many of them haven't, want to do it. It's something that has to be got out. So even today, we're receiving lots of artifacts, lots of testimony, and we're trying to capture that and work as hard as we can. And one of the changes in our organization over the years has been the amount of research that we've had to do. So rather than just tell a story, and rather than just have educators who are very good at communication with particularly young people, we now have archivists and researchers who are making sure that our underpinnings are absolutely copper bottom. They will need to be when we don't have first-hand testimony. Our learning programs, full-time education staff, not only look at primary education, and I'm convinced it is the starting point. Often today, Educators talk about a spiral curriculum where you revisit and reinforce. Where do you root the spiral? The answer to me is very much in primary education. It is very much about values education. By the time we get many of our secondary education visitors, a lot of them have bought into the myths, particularly about refugees, about difference, and that is a real worry to us. We're doing more in terms of higher education, whether it's with history courses, theology courses, certainly teacher education is becoming very popular. We're running out of space. But we're also working in communities, and we're using the resources of the centre to do some challenging work. And this is perhaps where the purists in the Holocaust education field would say, what on earth are you doing? But certainly every survivor I speak to is not interested in just looking through the prism backwards or the lens backwards. They want to know that what they're saying today is having some impact on what is happening in communities, what's happening in the press, what's happening that we read about that we definitely do not like. So we're working in those communities that have been very vulnerable to extremist thinking. We've targeted some of those areas that have embraced BMP, EDL, Britain First, and we are working with both parents and their children to try and get them to see difference differently. And one of the things that we've done is to evaluate that work. Can we change, with the programs that we offer, can we actually change people's attitudes towards difference? Because strip everything else away, and the story of the Holocaust, like many wars, conflicts around the world, is an inability to deal with difference. So we do that. We work with young parents and carers. We have hate crime workshops where we're working with local authorities, we're working with police, probation, oversubscribed. Everybody wants to know, how do we deal now with all this pernicious stuff that's flying about in our communities? Where's it come from? And everybody says that received wisdom is Brexit hasn't made it easier, but it's not that. It's more than that. There's a lot of this popular nationalism about, and how do we challenge some of those statements that are made in our name, in our community's names. So rather than just sitting back and waiting for the public who want to come, we're trying to take what we do out into those communities. We're doing that as well with police forces, with local authorities. We're talking about leadership. We're reminding people about the values that went missing during the Holocaust. One of the great lessons to learn is not about the historical facts, who did what to whom. What were the values that went missing during that period? And how can you get children to understand those and guard against those? And to do that, you simply cannot give answers about the Holocaust. You teach people to ask questions. I know that's very cliched, but that's what we try and do, so that that questioning is valid today and tomorrow and thereon. So, the thing that knits everything together at the centre, everything, is that every day of the week we have one, at least, usually two, sometimes three Holocaust survivors that we bring in from all over the country, mainly from London, a fair few from Manchester, from Leeds, from Liverpool, from Leicester. And it is they that somehow, in the giving of their story and the talking to, particularly to young people, make that connection, make that absolute connection between history, being a slice somewhere between X and Y, with everything that children know about families, about communities, about the human condition. They're extremely good. They're very practiced. They will speak for up to an hour, and then the best bit of all, they will take questions from the audience. And of course, children, young children in particular, are fearless. They would ask the questions that you wouldn't. You know, they're far too sensitive. You say, oh, gosh, you can't ask that. But they do. And survivors will answer them because they know it's real. And isn't that wonderful when they ask real questions? So that is the bit that brings it all together. And that is the bit that we're going to talk about next, because these survivors, as you know, are getting old. And what we do about that, and to take you on the next part of our journey, I'm going to hand over to Sarah.
It's really a real privilege to be here to talk to you about some of the work we're doing at the Centre, and particularly the work we're doing with survivor testimony. So as Phil's just described so eloquently, as always, the unique role of Holocaust survivors at the Centre, we really have a really precious educational resource, and it's a fantastic archive, really, of personal experience and knowledge. And we find it's a really powerful way of translating the history and the horror of the Holocaust to the public in a way that they can understand. But of course, our problem was that all of that experience and knowledge that we use every day at the Centre through the survivors was going to be lost. The 40 survivors at the Centre that speak at the Centre daily are, to put it mildly, I'm sure they won't mind me saying this, are not getting any younger. The youngest speaker was born in the camps. Many speakers are in their late 80s and 90s. And obviously, worldwide, there is a significant pool of recorded video testimony. But from our knowledge and experience of the testimony experience with audiences, is that really suggested to us that the recorded testimony wasn't going to solve the issue about public engagement with the subject. As Phil described, when visiting the Centre today, children and adults have the opportunity to ask survivors questions and to receive an answer. And that really enables them to make a connection with the events of the past, with the person that's experienced those events. And it was really that engagement, the ability to take a personal inquiry and to pursue it, that connection that was going to be lost. So the challenge for us was, how could we digitally replicate the experience that children and adults currently have at the Centre and preserve it for future generations? How could we place a survivor in our memorial hall in years to come? So we started to look at the digital options, and following research, we put out a tender to invite solutions that would really work for the Centre and what we were trying to achieve. Importantly, that solution would need to fit within our budget and that was realistic for us to achieve. But it also really needed to be replicable, because we wanted to create something that would be able to be used on an ongoing basis for a number of different survivors. So we selected interpretive designers Bright White Limited, and we developed a project team that included Bright White, a range of Centre staff, particularly our educational team, and Professor Eunice Marr from the University of Huddersfield, where she's Professor of Digital Media. We also worked in collaboration with the Shoah Foundation and the Institute for Creative Technologies in Southern California. One of the first things we really looked at the flow of conversations in the hall, the experiences that our audiences have with survivors when they're speaking. And we particularly looked at the role of the facilitator, which you can see here marked in green. The facilitator hosting the process with groups, and the role of that facilitator, the role of the audience, and the role of survivor, and how those interact within the hall. At the moment, the facilitator, who is usually an educator, plays a really key role in chairing questions from the floor, repeating questions from the survivor speaker where necessary, and really encouraging participation. One of the key things as well is that the facilitator really sets the tone amongst the audience, emphasising to the group the nature of the testimony that they're going to hear, and bringing in references to learning that the group, which is often school children, references to learning that they've already experienced within the exhibitions. So by looking at the current dynamics within the auditorium, we could consider what digital problems we needed to solve through the project. So a solution to that experience was proposed, and it's really best illustrated by introducing you to Stephen Frank. This is Stephen. Stephen's been speaking at the National Holocaust Centre for many years. He speaks regularly. And like all our survivor speakers, his experience and his story are unique, personal, and very moving. He was born in Amsterdam in 1935. Stephen's father joined the Dutch resistance. One morning in 1943, his father said goodbye before leaving for his office, for his work, and Stephen never saw him again. Stephen was taken with his remaining family to Barneveld before being taken to Westerbork transit camp and then to Theresienstadt. Stephen was liberated in May 1945, actually remarkably with his mother and his brothers, who had also survived the camp. Stephen shares his story at the centre regularly, and also you can see alongside Stephen some of the artefacts and documents that he has donated to the centre, which really both support and bring richness to his story, and it means that the children, when they're visiting the exhibitions, along with adult visitors, can actually see some of the artefacts that Stephen talks about in his testimony. Our digital project, now known as the Forever Project, will enable a digital projection of Stephen to speak to students in the hall in years to come. And crucially, digital Stephen will not only be able to share his testimony, he'll also be able to answer the audience's questions years after he's no longer with us. So just to tell you a little bit about how we're enabling this to happen, Stephen was recorded using ultra-high definition 3D techniques. We recorded him not only giving his testimony, but we also captured his answers to almost 1,000 questions, many of which were frequently asked by children. Filming took place over a period of 5 days, producing around 20 hours of film about Stephen's story and his experience. All filming, as you can see from this clip of Stephen in the studio, took place against a black backdrop with Stephen wearing identical clothes for each filming session over those 5 days. Really importantly, we put a lot of thought into how the survivors were going to be looked after and treated during that week to make sure that they were comfortable. We deliberately chose a studio that had a friendly and comforting atmosphere where they could be well looked after and where they would be with staff that knew them very well. Because obviously with that amount of filming, we were going to be discussing things, as we found out during the course of the work, often that many of the survivors had never shared before. In advance of the shooting sessions, obviously questions were developed by the team using a strong methodology that we particularly developed for the project, which allowed breadth and depth of questioning. And it enabled us, really that methodology enabled us to investigate a number of different parts of Stephen's experience and his history. The team who put the questions together included individuals who'd heard Stephen's story for many, many years, which is why the involvement of the centre in developing the question set was so important. They could put in questions that were frequently asked by children, but also we included people within the question development that didn't know Stephen's story very well, which was also extremely valuable. The educators who participated in the question generation also tried to reflect key educational themes. So ensuring that questions were included around prejudice, faith, their attitude to forgiveness. The question sets really fell into two distinct groups. Firstly, there were questions that could be asked to any Holocaust survivor, quite generic questions. And secondly, there were questions that were particularly to do with Stephen Frank's individual story, questions about his mother, his father, his brothers, how their experience affected them. After that, questions, this is an example of the domain-specific questions here. The questions, after being generated, needed to be quite strictly prioritised and arranged well in advance of the filming, using a particular methodology to get the very best result on the shooting on the day and over the 5 days. So they weren't asked in themes. We haven't got time to talk about that now, but if anybody's interested, I can discuss it later. But the result of that for Stephen was a really significant personal archive, an archive of 20 hours of film for that individual person, but also an archive that in the future will be able to respond to the particular interest of the audience, which is going to be a really valuable resource for future generations. So using the specially recorded material, we've been able to create a digital life-size projection of the film Stephen, a digital projection who can answer questions posed by the audience. This is the original virtualization of the project in situ. This is a virtualization start of Stephen. It starts to give you some idea of how we're seeking to place Stephen in the space where he normally speaks. To get a proper and better view, you're going to have to visit the centre when the project's complete, which is imminent. So basically, the audience can listen to the projected Stephen telling his story, and then using a handheld microphone can ask Stephen questions about his experience and receive a response directly from Stephen. And the responses come from that archive of 1,000 pre-recorded answers. The system selects, from hearing the question, selects the closest answer from that set of 1,000 that's the closest match to the question posed. And you have to come and see it, but the answers, the question and answer, the time between the question and answer is actually very quick. It's the same length of time you would expect anybody to slightly pause before answering a question, which is something we're particularly pleased with. So that system's really been made possible through the integration of various different technologies, including natural language processing and real-time graphics. And it integrates elements that have been licensed, elements that have been specifically coded for the project, and the methodology that we've developed. Importantly, the real-time graphics that are employed are only used when Stephen is not speaking. Every time Stephen's speaking, it is from verifiable, authentic 3D film capture of Stephen directly. And obviously at the heart of this is the filmed content, or more specifically, the transcription of the 1,000 answers that Stephen gave over the 5 days, which was, as you can imagine, no small task. So those technologies and the underlying methodology applied enable this really personal archive to be engaged with, which I think has been the biggest thing for us. Not just allowing access to the archive, but it enables the audience to actually actively engage with it in a very personal way. Obviously, the project's not yet launched to the public, but it's imminent. We continue to test the experience with groups of young people. I mean, most recently, at the end of September, we had 2 scout groups in who were testing this for us and were talking to Stephen, or talking to the digital Stephen. And I've just noted some of the questions they asked. Are you related to Anne Frank? How did you respond to the restrictions? Did your mum persuade the prison cleaners to get into the prison? Stephen's mother did a remarkable thing and actually got him to speak to his father after he'd been taken away, and she dressed up as a cleaner to be able to do that. And it's a remarkable story. And also, one child asked, do you believe in God? And a question that's frequently asked to our survivors. And digital Stephen could answer all of those, which I was really pleased about. And it was very rewarding for the kids to be able to actually have that discussion with Stephen, even though he wasn't here. So we've tested and continue to test the engagement of young people with this approach. We're measuring both their satisfaction with the answer and the extent to which they feel the answer responded to the question they've asked, which are sort of subtly different things, because some people are very satisfied by the answer, even if it's not actually exactly answering the question that was asked. So it's showing very good results. Ultimately, obviously, its ongoing impact will be demonstrated as the digital testimony is integrated into the educational programme at the centre. But we already know that testimony is an incredible, powerful tool, really engaging tool for students, and makes a big difference. So we believe that really by preserving this experience as best we can, we'll ensure that our testimony collection will continue to have an impact well into the future. And apart from Stephen Frank, we've also recorded a further 9 survivors in this way. Each survivor has answered between 850 and 1,400 questions. So one of our survivors answered 1,400 questions over 5 days, which is incredible. The survivors filmed to date really have a mix of experiences, and we tried to look at a mix of camp survivors, kinder transportees, men and women, hidden children, to really try and get that richness. We'd love to do some more filming to increase that richness as well. So we now have a really substantial collection of material that people will be able to access both imminently and in years to come. And as Phil mentioned earlier, I mean, the importance of this is really coming home as each year we are losing survivors or they're becoming too ill, unfortunately, to speak. So in terms of our next steps, as I mentioned, the Forever Project, as it's now known, has taken a number of years to come to fruition. It's involved the centre's educational staff, operational team, interpretive designers, Bright White, and researchers. And we've learned a substantial amount. We're currently still in testing, but work for us really doesn't stop there. We're really likely to film further survivors to increase that mix. And we've got a real interest from organisations in the Holocaust education field who really want to look at how the work we've done can support Holocaust education generally. We're also collaborating with similar work taking place in Southern California through the USC Shoah Foundation. We also really want to look at how we can apply these techniques in different contexts and potentially to existing archives. Can the tools used for question-answer matching and for filming be applied to existing archive footage? And we're certainly interested in hearing from organisations who could benefit from the approach or have ideas for different applications. So whilst this work has really been born out of and really driven by a specific and urgent need at the National Holocaust Centre, it also has the potential to deliver real benefits elsewhere. But I think in general, the work we've done on the interactive testimony has really transformed the way in which we see ourselves as an organisation, and it's opened our minds to the potential for new technologies and how it can help support our mission and our archive. As Chris Walker from Bright White said to us at the beginning of the project, the technology should really be invisible. It's just about how you can actually use technology to further enhance your mission, and the technology just enables you to deliver that. So with that in mind, and briefly just at the end, we're now working on another digital project to digitise one of our key exhibitions, The Journey, which Phil talked about earlier on. So as Phil mentioned, The Journey is a physical exhibition at the centre, which has got an international and national reputation for primary education. It's a very immersive, narrative-based exhibition, which, as Phil mentioned, follows the story of a 10-year-old German Jewish boy, Leo. It focuses particularly on the refugee and the Kindertransportee experience, so it's extremely topical. What we're going to do is actually, because The Journey lends itself to an immersive narrative digital experience, our digital journey that we're going to develop does not seek to create a simple 360-degree online tour of our existing exhibition. What we're focusing on is using digital potential to create a virtual experience which is truly valuable in its own right and truly immersive in its own right, and one that adds value to the physical experience. It's learning-led, very much so, and focused on delivering high-quality education around a very challenging subject. Like the current journey, the virtual experience will enable visitors, children in particular, to interact with the objects around them and to discover artefacts, to hear the stories behind them, and to go into the rooms where those objects are. They'll be able to see and find out about real artefacts and follow Leo's very immersive and powerful narrative. There'll be strong material and links with the needs of teachers in schools. So as you can imagine, it's a pretty substantial project. The project team for this also includes academics, researchers, educators, curatorial staff, research staff, and digital interpretation specialists. Academic input also includes Professor Eunice Marr again, who has got a particular interest in using digital media and virtual experiences for serious topics. We also are identifying particular specialists in certain subjects who can help with particular issues around the recreation of the journey. So, for example, we have a specialist looking at architecture in 1930s Berlin who's helping us with constructing that virtual environment. As part of the work, we're researching the artefacts and testimony archives already at the centre to establish their potential relevance and the power they can bring to the virtual environment. And that's being helped by work that we're already doing to digitise our collections and to record the stories from survivors about those artefacts. So the digital experience provides a real opportunity to include rich archival material that's not been possible to include in the physical exhibition. It also provides an opportunity to substantially increase our reach as a museum and a centre of learning. So in terms of key learning from these projects for the centre, firstly, the centre has and continues to have a really powerful, urgent need for these projects. The risks and the opportunities were such that the centre decided to invest in this work and needed to invest in this work in order to preserve and extend our core mission. Substantial funding had to be generated for both projects. These are pretty advanced digital projects that needed substantial funding behind them. And we're also dedicating quite substantial time to the development and completion of the projects. But there's a really strong belief now, there's a really strong belief that this is how we can preserve and strengthen our relevance and reach, and the potential's already being seen. Secondly, I think the interdisciplinary work, particularly being shown with the development of the virtual journey experience, is extremely valuable, and having that mix of individuals around the table makes a huge difference. And it really highlights how, like many probably in this room, can see how there's a strong link between the physical and the digital, and how those different themes and different media can work together to make a powerful difference. So we really look forward to sharing experiences and developing collaborations with organisations here, and would love to be able to discuss this at greater length afterwards. Phil, thank you.